the end of the day, we never anticipated running a building. We thought somebody would come in and say, let's help us make this happen. And that hasn't really happened. We've had people offer to buy it. One in the last 12 months was really enthusiastic, wanted to help the community, wanted to get involved, knew about spas and everything. And when it came down to it, he wanted it to be a £500 a night Airbnb. Yeah, and I said I could never leave my house again were I to sell out our community like that.
You alright, guys? You alright? Are you alright? Yeah, it is. You alright? Yeah. Yeah, new to YouTubing, yeah. So I used to live up here. I used to live on Dyervale Way.
Right.
And then I always used to walk past here with my dog, and like I thought I'd love to get inside and have a look what it looks like. Are you Fiona?
Yes.
Oh, this is Sarah, my wife.
Yeah,
Fiona.
right.
You alright? Oh, what are you doing here then? Just setting up? Or?
Yeah, well, we're setting up because the tours start at 11, like, so because of the state of the building and everything, we have to pretty much start from scratch every day.
Yeah.
It's not like
Right.
and just leave stuff.
No.
Especially if we leave any food down the squirrels have had it that time.
Yeah.
Oh,
We've got some fat balls for birds. If you look on bird feed,
yeah.
one of them's nicked the base.
Oh dear.
Fat balls, and you're in my name is Fiona. Thank you for coming today to what is our 6th year of Heritage Open Days. I'm Fiona. My glamorous assistant today is Victoria and Holly as well. And I hope you enjoy the talk. I don't know how much any of you know about Birley Spa, but this building here was built in 1843. But the history of this site goes back way further than that. When they were building the council houses around here in the early 50s, a local archaeologist found flint microliths on the site. These are between 3,000 and 8,000 years old, part of the Mesolithic era, part of the Stone Age. These flint microliths are now held at Weston Park Museum. It was reported at the time that as the site was so disturbed, there was little point in any further excavation. We did a couple of years ago now, an archaeologist from Sheffield University came. He wanted to work with us, unfortunately was unable to do so, but what he said was that if there'd been life here in the Stone Age, there's been life here throughout. So instantly we've got thousands of years of history for this site we know absolutely nothing about. There is also a very widely held urban myth that the pool inside the building is a Roman bath. It categorically definitely isn't. However, Romans were in this area. The Shire Brook is the border between Mercia and Northumbria when the Romans were here. We're not very far away from the Ricknold Way, the Roman road, and there are written accounts that this site, prior to a building being on it, was a steep hillside with water spouts gushing forth. There is no doubt whatsoever Romans will have stumbled upon this site, but as there's been no archaeology done, we can neither confirm nor deny that they were here. We're not entirely sure how it came to be believed that this was a Roman bath, although we have a suspicion, and I'll talk about that later. The first known building on this site was built in 1705, and it was built by a gentleman called Sutcliffe, who was a doctor and a Quaker, and he built it purely for personal bathing. It was a simple square stone structure where you would enter inside for your bathing experience, just latch the door, and when you'd done, you'd leave it open for the next person. We know that that building was built in 1705 because it had a really rather fancy headstone on it that said 1705. That stone is now lost somewhere on this site. In 1734, Dr. Thomas Short of Sheffield wrote his book, The Mineral Waters of England. Birley Spa is mentioned in that book on the same page as Buxton. So in 1734, at least, this water had some relevance. By 1795, the building was still shown on maps. By 1805, it's shown as a pile of stones with a small hollow, indicating that it may have either been demolished or collapsed, although fairly likely that neither of those are exactly right, because a full year before any work on this building was started, a local builder was commissioned by two businessmen to reseal the previous pool, and he did extensive work. He was knocking walls down and all manner of things to achieve what he'd been required to do. We only know about this at all because the businessmen didn't pay him, and he took them to court. And although he carried out the work in 1841, it was 1844 before he got his day in court. So history teaches us that some things don't change very much at all over time. But it's also quite interesting because it does mean that quite likely that a lot of the stone from that building will be incorporated into this one. Now in 1816, the second Earl of Manvers, Charles Herbert Pierpoint, took up his seat in Parliament and over the estate of his brother, which is Thoresby Hall in Nottinghamshire. And this was part of his very, very huge estate. Now, it was said at the time that the locals had implored him to make something here so that people could come from far and wide to take the waters because they'd known the benefits of them for hundreds of years. Unfortunately, the Earl of Manvers began to look at this as an option for himself. Worth pointing out that by 1842, the Earl of Manvers was 64 years of age, so perhaps the idea of curative and restorative waters had a little bit more of an appeal to him by then. So plans were drawn up for a most commodious establishment to be built in the Dutch style, making use of the topography of the site, having the lower floor built into the building and the upper floor, which was a hotel, on plain view for all that came down the driveway. A committee was set up of local businessmen to oversee the building and running of the site. One of those involved was one of the Staniforths from the Sickle Works in Hackenthorpe. They appointed a manager, and George Eden and his wife were to look after the spa, and Mrs. Eden proudly proclaimed that all visitors would be treated to hot coffee and bread and butter after their bathing experience. And pardon? Sadly no, sadly no. The building opened to great fanfare
on the 1st of May 1843. You could get a stagecoach here from the commercial inn in town. The Earl of Welbeck came every day for a week to have a hot bath, but he didn't stay here. He stayed at the Tontine Hotel in town. But much as it set off to a great start, they just really never got the footfall. Over the years, managers changed, the prices changed, the footfall never increased. By the 1870s, it ceased to be a hotel. There's no explanation in the records we've seen as to why it was not a success, but there are a few possibilities. It was probably coming towards the end of the spa boom, so perhaps the novelty was wearing off. Although this was described as being in a rural and sylvan glen, you had to pass at least 3 pits on the way here. There was the heavy industry of the sickle works in Hackenthorpe. It perhaps wasn't the nicest area to get to this rural and sylvan glen. But the overarching thing was that the actual cost of using the bathing facilities was well beyond the reach of the average working man. So by the brief period of the 1880s, it was a public house for long enough for the runner of it to be prosecuted for serving serving alcohol beyond hours, and somebody else to be prosecuted for drinking it as well. So, and that was the end of that. By the 1890s, a local farmer was living in the building. It's not clear whether the pool was in any use by then. We do know that the heated pool had been removed, and that it was said that the Earl of Manvers had taken his marble home. So that was the end of that. In 1912, the then 4th Earl of Manvers put the site up for sale, and it was purchased by a local businessman called George Molson, a cab driver of Handsworth. And it is at this point in the talk that I point out I am not a historian. I've had to learn it because I'm the one who is daft enough to say, do you do history talks? Yes, we do. And then I had to learn the history. And then during lockdown and from talking to a lot of local people, I've also learned that a lot of the accepted history isn't quite right, but that's another story. But yeah, so it doesn't come naturally to me. So I had a vision in my head when George Molson, cab driver, was mentioned. It wasn't this. That is George Molson with his dapper hat and his lovely moustache aboard his cab. Yeah. Well, cab driver is what they said, but I think charabanc would suit it very well indeed. Yes. Yes. So he, along with his partner Smith, reimagined the whole site as the children's pleasure grounds. There had just been a stream going through the grounds. They dug out what we now see as the pond and made a boating lake. They put in a paddling pool. There was a sand pit. There was a wishing well somewhere in the garden. Favourite joke is if you disappear, you'll have found it. There were dragon boat swings. If the kids were really bored, you could stand them in front of the magic wonder tree and see if they could see in its gnarled branches the shapes of strange animals and faces of people. Because we didn't have the internet and kids knew how to play. You came into the site, up to daisy, by a turnstile. There were donkey rides in the summer. And if you were feeling bold enough, you could take a dip in the Roman style bath. And over time, I think that's where the thing of the Roman bath actually came from. So it was renowned as being the most important and the popular time for Birley Spa up to the outbreak of the Second World War, when, not dissimilar to COVID times, a law was brought in banning people from gathering in groups. The building closed its doors, never to reopen. Not strictly true, as it turns out, that George Molson actually passed away in 1928 and the whole site was sold. It was sold to somebody called Smith. It's not clear whether it was his partner Smith or another Smith, with it being quite a popular name. But there's an account from ramblers who stumbled upon the site and were slightly dismayed to see it not as well cared for as it had been, but they were able to get a cup of tea and a bun, so they were quite happy overall. The children's pleasure ground, though, was a key point in our social history because it was a point at which people were starting to have leisure time. This area wasn't then and isn't now a wealthy area. People couldn't necessarily afford to go on holiday, but they could afford to come to Birley Spa, and they came again and again and again. Now, the next key point that we know of for definite in history was 1952. This area, which had always come under Derbyshire, suddenly came under Sheffield City Council, and they compulsory purchased this site from Sanderson and Newbold Steelworks of Attercliffe. Again, another key point in our history of being concerned about workers' welfare. They purchased the site and converted the boating lake, stocked it with fish, and had it as an angling club, and at some point tennis courts were added afterwards as well. We don't know when they bought it, but during lockdown I got talking to a lady, and we got on about Birley Spa, and she said, oh, people don't seem to care about it anymore, it's such a shame. And I said, oh, excuse me, actually yes they do. And she said, well, my family were the last people to live down here. And she was able to go back to the one surviving relative who'd lived here, and this is actually all the people who lived here, and this is Whitsuntide 1944. So it was while the Second World War was still on, so you can see the photo is fairly adult male light, because they'll have still been off somewhere. Now it's worth pointing out at that point in time, where the private residences, there were 2 stone cottages. Across the driveway, there were 2 wooden bungalows. We have no idea when they were built, why they were there, or who these people were that lived in them. But there was 2 families that lived in the spa, and I was able to say to this lady, why did your family live there? And she said, I don't know. So she went back and asked the surviving relative, and her parents had lived here, and her father was employed by Sanderson and Newbold as a caretaker for the site. His daughter, who is the surviving relative, when she was old enough, she became the PA to either Mr. Sanderson or Mr. Newbold, so the links with the site were quite strong. When the council bought the site, over time, they moved the families out, and the building became known as Birley Spa Tenants Hall, which for us is a really important stage because it was when it became a community building. So this building has been a community building since 1965. Just prior to lockdown, we were going to do an oral history production with Sheffield University. As lockdown hit, the university quite rightly had a meltdown of how they were going to deal with it. The problem ended up being it took them that long to sort it out. Lockdown had ended, the students had left, and it never actually happened. But I did get to meet a few people who I did go and speak to, and I met a brother and sister, Marie and David, and they lived here probably around the time that the council bought the site, and for a few years after, until they were eventually rehoused by the council. They started living in the wooden bungalows. That was Marie stood on the veranda of one of the wooden bungalows. That's her and David playing in the grounds of the spa, because it was like one big happy family down here. There was a third brother who has actually reached out to talk to us, but he doesn't live in Sheffield anymore, so I haven't had the chance to talk to him. And they moved into the Rose Cottages for a while until they were rehoused in Bayton.
Where were the bungalows?
Bang across the driveway here. So they had some very vivid recollections. And again, it was a steep learning curve for me, what a child's understanding of a situation is and reality, and trying to thread between the two. Marie, particularly with her being young, had very vivid memories that weren't always necessarily right. She recalled playing in a derelict Victorian tea room, which got me very excited because we didn't know anything about this. And it transpired in the end it was probably a greenhouse that was here. They talked about some of the neighbours that they'd had while they were down here. There was a gentleman who lived at the side of them who grew his own vegetables, and he self-fertilised all his own vegetables, which they remembered very clearly, and I don't suppose you would forget something like that. And they also had a neighbour, a Mrs H, who died by bees. And even though David was older, that was all they would say on the matter. She died by bees. And it got me deeply intrigued. Was it all the bees? Was it just one bee? And somebody on one of these talks said, do you think she died and there were bees nearby? I don't know, but I'd be very intrigued to try and find out. They also spoke of one of the families that lived in here, and they said there was a Greek gentleman who was into scuba diving and walked around with a very big whip. Well, it turns out he was part of the family that the lady I'd met knew. So I asked her, and she went back to her relative. And turns out he was Maltese, not Greek. He was indeed into scuba diving, and it will have been, you know, the proper diving helmet and everything. But he categorically did not walk around with a very big whip. And we think it was probably the air pipe that they recall seeing. But to small children, it was a whip. And, you know, they were, say, a very close-knit community. The lady herself recalled going to school in Hackenthorpe, and there was the local pub at the side of it. And she used to love coming out of school, and all the huntsmen from the Barlow Hunt would be here in the finery, but she liked to see the horses. The Barlow Hunt came here for years and years and years, hunting foxes in the gorse over there. So yes, the council owned it from the 50s, community building from 1965. Its history remains checkered. And when we were trying to do various bits of research, it seemed very confusing, because you'll have timelines where you'll get one group of people saying it was lovely, it was really nice, we had our wedding here, we did this, we did that, and then others saying it was derelict, it was a mess, and it just didn't really make sense. Transpires in the end that the difference between those people were the age they were at the time, and adults were using the upper floor, which had some level of restoration or maintenance to it, whereas much younger people were getting in here and having a whale of a time where it was derelict and very much abandoned. A lady walked past here one day and said that if her and her friends could get in, they'd play a game where they'd sit with the backsides in the water, and the one who could keep it there the longest was the winner. Yes. In 1973, the building was listed. During the 80s, agencies, volunteer groups, the council sort of came together, and sort of from the early 90s, the Lost Valley project started, late 80s, early 90s. And that extended from here all the way across to Shirebrook Valley. Part of that group was a gentleman called Alan Bailey, who I used to see regularly here when I walked my dogs. Now, the building was in use. There had some partial restoration, but that probably meant the upper floor. There was a luncheon club operated upstairs. This railing wasn't here, and the dog I had at the time had to regularly be wrestled out of the kitchen because he'd be straight in there to see what was on offer for the luncheon clubs and things.